my distinct honor and pleasure. This is actually the third time I've had an opportunity in a public forum to introduce our very distinguished speaker today, Harry Gamboa, Jr. And it's just, I think in many ways it's been transformative experience to know Harry. Just to know him a little bit, so I'm really thrilled to be able to introduce those of you who don't yet know him here today. If you don't know him, the biography that we have up on the web is pretty direct. You know, it says renowned essayist, photographer, performance artist, and director. In fact, he's at CalArts. He's director of photo media. He's founder and director of the international performance troupe Virtual Verite, and co-founder in 1972 of OSCO, this I think now legendary, famous Los Angeles-based performance group. Here's just the retrospective of OSCO's work, and as you can see, this is an incredible body of work, and not just in quantity, but in quality. And if you talk to any art historian, they are gaga over Harry, just wild about Harry. And I'm proud that my alma mater, Williams College, put together this. But Harry Gamboa is also an amazing innovator, he's a photographer, but also an innovator in many forms. And I think one of the most amazing things about his work going back to the early 1970s even, is to use space, to energize space in creative and in sometimes amazingly irreverent and radical and subversive ways, to claim public spaces for the public, particularly, and we're talking about Los Angeles, so that was not always an easy thing to do. And that means taking traffic medians, I love those little islands, or on a left turn lane. That means using the sidewalks and walls. That means using the street itself. But he's also used the bully pulpit in so many ways too. This is a collection of Harry's essays. So as an essayist, he has extended this site-specific practice into a kind of literary domain, another form of a space as well that has also, I think, been transformative for many of us who are interested in Los Angeles. So I don't want to spend any more time holding off on the big event. So let me welcome Boyle Heights native son, Harry Gamboa, Jr. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you very much for the invitation to present some of my work. I was born in 1951 in Los Angeles, the start of the atomic testing, which is very important in my upbringing. Also, being in Los Angeles and Boyle Heights, being Mexican American, sort of locations where probably just a little bit over 100 years prior to my birth had been a very aggressive war that came in to sweep in and to secure manifest destiny, which then kind of preset an arrangement in the sort of treatment of Mexican Americans, family members. When I was born, had experienced something known as, which is now referred to as the Zoot Suit riots, which actually was, again, a secondary military invasion of Mexican Americans to secure that the influence of of Chicanos who were identified as Pachugos, that is, they were from El Paso, Texas, speaking their own dialect, would be eliminated, quite physically eradicated, which of course they failed to complete. So when I was a young child, I only spoke Calo, which is C-A-L-O with an accent over the O, which was a dialect developed during the Mexican Revolution. My introduction to elementary school at 4.5 was quite exciting, as for all children. However, I was greeted with a slap in the face, and at 4.5, and was forced to construct my own dunce cap, in which the teacher inadvertently spelled the word Spanish and placed it atop my head. And my cousin had taken me to school on my first day, and told me that I was basically being declared incompetent, ignorant, and unwanted. The teacher's desire to shame me into speaking English was a little too late. All my relatives had been here for quite a long time, had all served in World War I, had served in World War II, and my grandfather, who was 4'11", insisted my first day of school that if I ever encountered a Nazi, my role was to kill that Nazi. And so, as being an elementary school child, I saw my teacher, and I think I discovered the first Nazi. And so, but fortunately, I was not as pure in warriorship as all my relatives. And the idea was, once I understood that it was a linguistic situation I was in, I was determined to learn to control the English language at a much higher level than the principal of that elementary school, which I think I was able to achieve by the 4th grade. But also it set a pattern for me at a very early age that this was an institution that was unfriendly to me, it was unfriendly to my colleagues, my cohorts. I immediately scaled the fence, realizing that the confined space of the school grounds seemed a little too tight for me, particularly being in Boyle Heights, which was a very interesting place at the time. It was a very diverse community. Many of my friends were the children of the Japanese Americans that had been interned. There were many people of Jewish descent. There were people who were Irish, Italian, Germans, and also a group of people known as Moroccan Russians. And so all my best friends in the kindergarten and 1st grade were 6-foot-tall children that would be my friends. And I would go in and out of school quite often, never really, and I must tell you that I actually, in my entire life, have never taken a test, I've never done homework, I was simply pushed forward through school. It turned out to be kind of a very interesting experience because most of my learning took place in the streets, and very much experiencing sort of a spatial inequality, sort of the signifiers of space. What is it that determines a good neighborhood, a bad neighborhood, who belongs, who does not belong? Many of my friends who might join me, quite literally, many of them never made it far enough to reach teenagehood. Actually, at a very early age, it was kind of indicated that we were not really desired, and by middle school, they were already promoting the Vietnam War. And soldiers would come on campus, they would pass out assent forms for the children, that is 15-year-old children, my friends, to hand to their parents, which would then designate them capable of joining the Marines, and the Marines would declare them to be 17 years old. So many of my friends were killed at the age of 15, 16, 17 in the Vietnam War. I used to read the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and tell my friends, don't go, and one day a soldier heard me speak in one of these situations, and they held me up, and they quite literally beat me in front of the students, and the harder they hit me, the more I laughed. And the more I laughed, the harder they hit, and it actually unnerved people, because I was not about to cry and shed a tear for their brutality. I was injured quite seriously. And it just ensured my commitment to learning and to sharing and to maybe reinterpreting what space is about and how to use. It was actually a way of preparing myself to endure the next era, which would be high school, where I became a very well-known student leader in something known as the East LA walkouts. I recently looked at the description of the East LA walkouts on Wikipedia, and there is one paragraph that describes students seeking a better education, but the second paragraph talks about how J. Edgar Hoover and Richard Nixon declared me to be the most dangerous young person in the United States at that time, and how I was placed on essentially what was a death list by COINTELPRO, by the Senate subcommittee on they called it the extent of subversion in the New Left. Fortunately, I had met Bobby Kennedy much earlier, and I believe there was some kind of interference in their efforts because basically, if you look at that list, many of the people that were placed on that list were found to be poisoned, murdered, placed in jail for 20, 30, 40 years. Some of my dear friends were placed unjustly in federal prisons, state prisons for a very long time. Some of us survived, of course, including Angela Davis, a handful of other people. The idea was that there was a sergeant from the LAPD, and his testimony was that if I was ever allowed to be in front of young people, I might have some level of influence. And I'm glad to say I've been teaching since 1988. So here, in the 1970s, by the way, the East LA walkouts was the largest and first major demonstrations by Mexican Americans versus the policies of the United States. It was greeted immediately by police violence. Students were shot, they were hurt, they were arrested. This led to the formation pretty much of the Chicano movement, which was very concerned with the Vietnam War, which then resulted in actually the largest demonstration on the West Coast in 1970, known as the Chicano Moratorium, where various techniques of military oppression were tested on a domestic population, my neighborhood. They used various forms of poison gases, they used new weapons, they used domesticated versions of militarized weapons. It was the first time that portable video was utilized to gather facial identities. Children were run over, they were beaten, there's a lot of documentation. There was also the assassination of Ruben Salazar, a well-known journalist, the first Spanish language, English language journalist. He was doing research on police violence, and of course he was murdered. This resulted in kind of it was sort of a normalized violence in East LA against Mexican Americans, and so I'm kind of setting this up. The idea of this kind of violence was rather tremendous. I've actually written about this. You could probably find one or two things online, but less than a year later, after the extreme violence, and by the way, it included hundreds and hundreds of police officers from LAPD, LA County Sheriff, LA Highway Patrol, California National Guard, secret police, and of course the men in gray suits. And so less than a year later, there was a very small group of people protesting, carrying candles, peaceful protesters walking on Arizona Avenue, approaching Whittier Boulevard, and as we approached, 25 police officers with 12 and 16 gauge shotguns lifted the barrels of their guns and free fired into the crowd using live ammunition, emptying several hundred rounds into the crowd, and everyone started falling. Many people bloodied, many people killed. Both the LA Herald Examiner, the LA Times, claimed that one person was killed, another one said 3 people were killed. Nonetheless, all of the evidence was eliminated within a couple of days when the LA County declared eminent domain on the entire area, bulldoze the entire place, eliminating the space and creating a brand new space by widening the streets, wide enough, mathematically wide enough to allow the military tanks, and it would be the first time that military hardware was incorporated into a domestic police force, to be placed and situated at the LA County Sheriff's Substation in 3rd Street, which they never actually had to use after that because the violence was so extreme. Many of the activists and survivors who happened to be there, amongst the most brilliant people, all decided to go back to college. And many of the people then went on to receive their PhDs, including Raul Ruiz, who received his PhD at Harvard, who actually had a magazine called La Raza, of which I worked for. I myself was a pretty young person at the time. I was in my teens, and it felt to me that to respond with hatred would be self-defeating, and that to quite possibly to counteract hatred would be to maybe make a conceptual statement by utilizing the restricted space of East LA and converting it into a form of art, transforming it from, and I've kind of have had sort of a theme since childhood, and that is to have fun in dystopia. So here we go. So this work here was, I had formed a group called OSCO, which means nausea in Spanish. Unfunded, unincorporated, just sort of a group of artists, very talented artists, Willie Heron, Patsy Valdez, Gluvio Grunk-Nicandro, Humberto Sandoval, and myself. I did invite one other artist who declined. His name was Mundo Mesa, a very brilliant painter. This would have been our second performance on Whittier Boulevard. The first one, which is actually on display at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, is titled Stations of the Cross. That would have been at the beginning of 1972, where we made a crucifix out of cardboard smeared with all kinds of horrible materials, dragging it. Willie Heron was dressed as sort of a ghost. I was an altar boy with an actual dog skull atop my head. Grunk was dressed as someone named Popcorn, sort of a marionette tossing about popcorn. We had marched up and down the street of Whittier Boulevard, which at that point was sort of the highly urbanized center of Chicano culture. And of course we had taken measurements before, but the idea was that we would go basically, although in public, at the same time surreptitiously approach the recruiting station of the military and wedge the cross into the doorway, disallowing people from entering. And for that one day, Chicanos would not go to Vietnam. This performance is called The Walking Mural, with Willie Heron and Patsy and Grunk walking on Whittier Boulevard. And at this point in time, it took quite immediately, both Grunk and Willie Heron inadvertently became world famous. They had painted murals. Willie Heron painted a very famous mural in City Terrace that still exists. When he found his brother had been stabbed 35 times by a gang, and he saved his brother's life, but he was disgusted with the gang violence, returned and actually knocked on people's doors and asked them if they had any paint, and overnight painted a sort of this very beautiful mural, which seemed to attract worldwide attention immediately, and so much so, and Grunk too was painting murals very nearby, that they were both featured in Exxon Corporation's annual report to investors, in which the wealthiest people in the world became aware of Grunk and Willie, and then they became sort of the subject of dialogue on the Johnny Carson show, which then brought them into television fame. And that kind of spurred on murals to be painted all throughout East Los Angeles. but it also served as a way by which Chicanos would now be allowed a particular corner in art canon, but you could only be an artist if you were a muralist. And so the idea was that Willie and Grunk decided that that was too confining. They needed to go out into the open, and so Willie Hearn decided to paint himself as a mural that peeled himself away from the wall. Patsy Valdez here is a Virgen de Guadalupe in black, sort of a different kind of version. And Grunk, of course, wore 7 different chiffon dresses and was a Christmas tree. So, of course, these images for many, many years were kind of distributed through public media, generally newspapers and magazines, but photographs did not yet exist as actual prints, but now, of course, they're in some of the major museums in the United States. This particular piece is called Instant Mural. This was being done in which Grunk taped Patsy Valdez and Humberto Sandoval to a wall. The performance lasted as long as it takes to unroll tape, taped into the wall. What happened was, during this period of time, would have been 1974, there was sort of an undeclared martial law in East LA. The police would disallow any groups of Chicanos, young Chicanos, 3 or 4 to gather. It would be declared a riot, or it would be declared some kind of conspiracy. You'd have to be very careful. So to do this, really, the work of OSCO, we would insert ourselves into declared no-man land zones in a way that was really our neighborhood. And so, again, this piece ended when Patsy and Humberto pulled themselves away from the wall. I made flyers and passed them out, and the idea was that most forms of oppression really necessitate the need of those who are oppressed to participate in their own oppression and not fight back. And so the idea of you peel away, you find that very much, generally, the controls are very fragile. This particular image is actually in the traffic island where I had mentioned the street had been widened. This would have been 3 years after the police attacked everyone, and I decided to direct everyone to have sort of a madcap meal where I had been standing as bullets were flying past me, and where all my friends had been killed or injured. And so this image, which is known as First Supper after a major riot, also generated a lot of interest among scholars, art cognoscenti, people who were looking for something regarding the urban space. But again, it's this idea of placement, of where you might engage and redefine a particular use of a place, and taking ownership, even though it's momentary. For instance, to take a photograph really sometimes only takes 1/10,000th of a second. The event, for all we know, may have lasted for less than a minute, which more likely is what took place. Again, this idea of going around and creating this sort of a spectacle, these kind of moments that might attract a lot of attention, it would be very dangerous to dress this way. And so this idea of going out and at the same time being very satirical of the kinds of things one could do, this is called the Gores. And of course, this was dedicated to all the children of Leslie Gore, the old famous singer. And the idea was that they would commit, these 3 individuals would go out and punish people that did petty crimes. And of course, these images have appeared in many, many publications, but the idea was, in East LA, was to combat what had been sort of a full-blown industry standard of creating negative stereotypes, and to counteract the negative stereotypes of Mexican Americans falling into these kind of tropes of being gang members, or being uneducated, being uninspired, having no role in the United States, not belonging here in Southern California, in which the whole purpose was not only to play and ownership, but also to invite people to join in. And so, and because we were all from the first TV generation, many of the kinds of things we did was to play with this. So this was kind of a riff on an old Twilight Zone. It's called Talking Tina, in which Telly Savalas cannot get rid of a child, a doll. Here we have Willie Heron, who at this point had already become very well known. And Willie is kind of he can just draw a straight line. He's very formal in the way he does work. And this doll kept jumping on the mural and smearing all of his paintings, trying to convince him to be an abstract expressionist. So again, towards the later 70s, a lot of attention started coming to our group, but again, it would always be tinged with this idea that we belonged in East LA. We should not leave East LA. We were Chicanos. We had sort of everything seemed to be tapped into some other kind of a Hollywood version of what they wanted. And so I decided that we would go to Malibu one day, and I found the great sewer in which all the movie star shit flows out of, and took this photograph, which kind of neutralized this. And this is actually a very well-known image that's appeared in many magazines, and actually a very large blow-up of this traveled the length of the British Isles and showed at every castle in England. But this is called Asshole Mural. So here we go. And again, this idea of utilizing space, for instance, even today, if you were to go and look at any print media, if you turn on your TV today, Chicanos are absent. They're absent from the conversation. There's so many people that are educated. You're not ever going to hear anyone's opinion about national policy, international policy, and you're certainly not going to hear about the fact that our children are put in cages. No other children are put in cages anywhere in the world. It's so normalized, no one even talks about it. It's just skipped over. But again, this idea of people being beautiful, and being able to participate in fashion, it's something that just doesn't happen. And so quite often OSCO was really about pushing that forward in a way. Let's give you a Vogue magazine cover, except this is Patsy Valdez sitting atop a tabletop at Philippe's, the diner in downtown LA. And this is called a la mode. And again, but this piece also has been in various locations. This is also part of the collection of the Whitney and part of the Smithsonian. And then this whole idea of what is American art. As I mentioned before, very early on, I was declared essentially an enemy of the state, followed by, and this would have been Richard Nixon, but then quite the opposite happened with Carter and Reagan, when through the executive branch I was declared an artist of America by receiving a National Endowment for the Arts, with cash and a beautiful love letter from 2 presidents, which I carried around for many years because I didn't have a passport. This piece, by the way, is it's probably the most well-known photograph that I've ever photographed. I went back to the location where many people had been murdered in the middle of this street by police gunfire. This is near Dittman and Whittier Boulevard. Way in the back where the lights seem to be glowing, way at the end would have been a place that's now known as Salazar Park, named after the assassinated journalist. I came back and laid road flares, lit up the church, placed the artist Grunk in the middle of the street. This was during a time that both the LA Times and the LA Herald Examiner used to sell a lot of newspapers. And so they would have a morning edition, a late morning edition, the noon edition. Their need to sell newspapers. They kind of latched onto the idea that East LA was full of gangs, which was not true, but they promoted this notion of gangs, and if anything ever went wrong with somebody, they would place the names and addresses of the relatives of the suspected gang members, where their pathway to get to work, and of course, ultimately, they were providing a mapping on how maybe their enemies might kill the other people, and this kind of led a pattern where they were facilitating gang warfare. and it seemed like there needed to be some kind of intervention. So I photographed this, and this is called Decoy Gang War Victim. This was a false gang war victim. This is all 35mm film. I must say that the blue lighting is as a result of mercury vapor lamps, which are illegal now, of course. They would create a wavelength that would generate skin cancer, and mercury vapor lamps were actually placed in impoverished neighborhoods throughout the United States and all throughout Los Angeles. They no longer exist. And so, and essentially, and also the glow at that time was still when they were still exploding nuclear bombs. So this is kind of like an irradiated, accentuated radiation. And really the idea was to create what's known as the Cherenkov effect blue that you find in nuclear reactors, which is very much an irradiated landscape, which is all of Southern California anyway. And so, so here we have Gronk frying on asphalt. I made duplicate 35mm slides. I put on a suit, a very young guy at the time, put on a suit, cut my hair, got a briefcase, and went up to Santa Barbara all the way to San Diego to all the various independent television stations, as well as the network television stations. The networks did not respond, but the independent television stations responded to my news release that I had photographed the last gang member to ever be killed. And this was actually shown on television, and it did have an effect, and it really caused a former right-wing pundit named George Putnam to choke on his own words. It took many, many years, but there was a show called Global Conceptualism, in which this image was declared to be one of the foremost conceptual events of the 20th century. And this is also one. On Bunker Hill, of course, the history of Bunker Hill is kind of very relevant to Mexican Americans. It is where the great battle and the flag was first raised in Los Angeles as a result of the invasion by the Mormon Battalion. Bunker Hill had been a place of great wealth and fanfare at the beginning of the 20th century, and then it broke down and became sort of the site for film noir locations, and then that was followed by even a further decay of the environment, but then it wound up housing hundreds of thousands of minorities there, which was considered blight by the Chandler family and others, who decided to level the entire mountain, and thus creating the economic center. And I went back there one day looking for my cousin's house, and it was gone. They had replaced it with skyscrapers. And when I looked at these skyscrapers, including Wells Fargo, and one would have to look at how Wells Fargo had treated the Bracero program and securing their funds and never paying out, I felt that it would be quite interesting to convince those owners of skyscrapers that maybe I had taken something back, and so I titled this Skyscraper Skin. This was published in the Downtown News, and when it got published, I received 2 letters from two different law firms demanding their skin back. So, yeah, they could keep it if they want. It's no skin off my whatever. Here we go. Again, this idea of utilizing 4 or 5 Chicano youth to create kind of this excitement, which in the end really was non-existent to some extent. The lived OSCO experience was all of us barely trying to make it alive. All 4 of the males had been attempted to be drafted. We all lived in various situations. We had all suffered police brutality, of course. Patsy Valdez also along this. But the idea was to somehow exude the notion of cool. Chicano cool, a sort of a disallowed version of Chicano cool that did not play into the role. And so, let's see, did we get this back? Here we go. Oh, here we go. So this particular piece also played with the notion of space. If you go to downtown LA and you go any of these kind of locations, if you look down, there's all sort of a brass plate. that said, this is private property, you may not cross over without permission. And at this point, I forget the name of this bank, but it was the tallest building in the United States, I guess, at that point, or in Los Angeles. And of course, now it's boarded up. But back then it was brand new. And so I started going to various locations to simply take photographs in places that were disallowed. And so here we took this photograph, and this is titled No Phantoms. I coined the phrase of phantom culture, indicating the Chicano culture that's never referred to, that exists only as a form of omission. But eventually, this particular image served as the homepage for the Smithsonian for several years. Again, the idea of incorporating different forms of use of space. As time went on, of course, I became more concerned and aware of space. It had to do also with maybe one or two scholars, maybe someone by the name of Schiffer Goldman and a number of other people, but this concept of something known as rasquachismo, which means making use of whatever available space and actually the extension of space. And if you go to some Mexican-American neighborhoods, the furniture is not limited by remaining indoors. So, and the same in the use. And so like, it's sort of this, everything is kind of open, and so, the way where people park cars and the way people do things and the way people present themselves, and everything is very performative. Again, making use of space for a momentary gesture. And these gestures are the ones that, done in the wrong place, might get you shot. But at the same time, might bring some connection and awareness. And of course, as we live in this kind of dystopian, everything being boarded, this particular image, again, would have been, the previous work was from the OSPO group. This would have been probably from the virtual verite. In a way, still utilizing kind of same ideas of performance. But here I had everyone confined in a pearl necklace. Again, some of the images that I create have a tendency to capture the imagination of somebody out in the world, but this actually served as a flag over Houston, believe it or not. And so I'm not sure what it denoted, but I think it had to do with that pearl necklace. And so again, some of these images really, the thing about the virtual verite was I had many of my performers were always on some level kind of off balance and counterbalancing, and this would have predated maybe the pandemic, but just kind of this sense that we were kind of tilting somewhere, and so the only possible way of really standing is to be kind of off step to counterbalance. And so the group was that, and you can't really stand this way without falling. And so, and the idea of witnessing what's so horrific, and at the same time remaining mute in the process. And again, for some reason, a lot of these images, particularly from this group, sort of were very, very relevant in Texas and a few other of the red states also. And so, again, performing on the streets, people that are the unpersons, unplaces, seem to be mimicking art. We now live in an era where things are kind of ill-defined. Some might be recognizable and at the same time unrecognizable. And so, for instance, during the past year, I've been working on a project which is dealt with people entering these kind of psychological fugues in which it's very difficult to discern between what is dreamlike state, what is actual state, as something we all go through every day. And how do we make sense of things and utilize our own sensory perception in responding to maybe make some kind of a cultural, political statement without being eliminated or blown up, as it were. Again, people returning from the dead, only on the way back to go to become dead. I wound up doing a lot of work in Europe, in which I would have people perform on the streets and also in Mexico City and in the United States. And the conditions, believe it or not, are pretty much the same, where everyone is really concerned about avoiding a nuclear catastrophe, and also trying to maintain kind of a commitment to familiar spaces. This was part of the 6th Street Bridge that was demolished. I did a project called the 6th Expanse, in which performers, I had people going back to the bridge, doing very mundane kind of behaviors, dancing, walking, kissing, fighting, laughing, and every time I took them there was less and less bridge. And of course, ultimately in the end there was no bridge, and now there's a brand new bridge after $1 billion. And I took a walk on it yesterday, and already a chunk of that bridge has fallen off. It's broken off. So it's, you know, and here was sort of a repeated character that I used during the group was the girl in the quinceañera who got lost at the age of 15 and returned 10 years later at the age of 25, missed her own party, but had much to say to the other 15-year-olds. And so here she is. Again, this lack of identity as we go, and we're anonymous, and I don't know, it seems like anonymous / autonomous as we go. This idea that we are unidentified only in our own minds, while we're actually subjected to facial recognition, biometric recognition, we are voice printed, and it's very difficult to remain unknown to those that collect such data, while there are so many people that are unknown to themselves. During the pandemic, of course, we found ourselves hidden away, trying to communicate, fearful of one another, and it became quite obvious that we may or may not survive. As we know, in East LA, there are 3 major crematoriums that were working 24/7. Boy, so many people vanished, and not a record really kept of all of that. So again, and that reminded me very much of the children that get put in cages, and also reminded me of my former friends from the Vietnam era, where just people, you may go out the door, but no real guarantee you're going to return. Again, the idea of having fun and having various behaviors that might not exactly match what's normally expected. These kind of sudden moments. The idea that we could one day be impressed upon to encounter major catastrophes, but it is possible to resist being witness to anything. Thank you. Yeah, of course.
You're gonna question?
Any questions? Of course. Sorry.
Yeah, we got lots of time, so good.
Bring this up, or you can come up here. Anyone? Question? Thoughts? There we go. Thank you.
Hi. So when you were talking, my name is Chris Rafferty. I'm a PhD student at FSU, and when you were talking about the different identification terms, significations of your identity as a Chicano, and you had a lot of names that I'm not even going to try to reproduce, but I recognize them because I'm rereading Entezula, and she talks about it, and she lists them in her borderlands, and she also claimed it as one of her many identities. And I thought it was very interesting that you just claim Chicano.
Yeah, I do just claim that. You know, the more popular term, of course, is Latino, and the other one, of course, is Hispanic. Both, by the way, created by the federal government. And so Hispanic was actually created by Nixon and his cohort of criminals, who actually then, you know, Cheney and Rumsfeld and, of course, Kissinger came up with this terminology to counteract the term Chicano. But the term Chicano is sort of indigenous, sort of self-identified. I was actually part of the group in 1968 to select the term in Denver by many of the Chicano activists. This, of course, the antecedents are actually connected to Nahuatl and a few other things, and the term was sort of a reversal of sort of a negative term, and to empower, and the term actually was identified that it would require additional material to add to the definition. And while the definition was being created, of course, gave time for the federal government to counteract that. And this had to do with the distribution of funds, federal funds, where the federal government made it compulsory to check off Hispanic if you wanted to apply for anything, to go to the hospital, to receive your any kind of Medicare or anything, and still to this day. And so you will find young Chicanos all throughout the country calling themselves Hispanic, and I'm sure the right-wing extremists of that era would be laughing at them that they were able to pull off this trick, which I'm sure you know, many of those people would have been very happy to do. And in the current terms, of course, people have added new terms which are adaptable to new people. But I strictly identify with Chicano because that term actually earned its place in blood.
So culture is representation, and you were talking about how Chicano is basically erased, that there is no representation. Nobody talks about it. When we talk about babies in cages, it's a hashtag.
Yeah.
It's nobody's saying Chicano babies in cages. So do you feel that that being a Chicano makes you erased in the United States? And yes, I do understand the systemic oppression that has made that happen, but do you personally feel like being Chicano means you are erased?
Being Harry Gamboa means I'm never erased. Okay, and as a representative of Chicano culture. I also must state that if the children were of any other ethnicity, it would not go unmentioned. You know, if they had any kind of other physical attributes or anything connected to any other group, it would simply be front page news. And it is the front page for Spanish language media, but never in English language. So it's just simply not shared with the English language as being a concern. And the fact that it's also a private entity supporting this. A couple of years ago, I participated in this project in which there was skywriting regarding private detention of immigrants, and my skywriting that was flown above a detention center in Bakersfield said "No ice, no ice," in which there were children and women placed, and they could see it from being within the walls. And as it was written in the sky, you could hear the voices from inside the detention center saying "No ice" and "No ice." And so this kind of thing requires people to not only bring attention to the surrounding communities, but to those that are actually affected also. And so, and again, it's just a one moment, the skywriting stayed, the wind blew it away, but for that one moment, very much like a photograph, it kind of existed as an ephemeral moment, but one that's very impactful for those that experience that moment.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for your talk. It stirred up so much in me because I'm actually an urban planner here moonlighting as a creative. And so to hear your stories and of how oppressing a city can be, and I'm trying to create spaces that allow for creative expression and are harmonious with the people who live in them. And your comment about how oppression is only possible if you participate, if you're a participant in your oppression. And just forgive me because I have so many thoughts and emotions swirling around as I try to make sense of this and also take the opportunity to speak to you. But how can we create, I guess so much of your work that is so stirring was only possible because of the awful oppression that we create in these cities. So how do we create spaces that allow for people to live harmoniously but also allow for creativity and expression in the absence of oppression? I don't know if that makes sense, but thank you.
I think one of the things you're talking about is like, how can we treat everyone humanely and at the same time introduce friendship and love and also fun, you know, in an environment. And again, maybe, I didn't mention, but maybe, I guess it would have been 1978, I worked with a handful of other young people. We were all from different groups, actually, to create an organization called Los Angeles Contemporary Exhibitions, which is known as Lace Gallery. This was sort of a grassroots gallery. Maybe 12 people, 12 of us formed this organization to present contemporary art in downtown LA. And it was a space in downtown LA that was 7,700 square feet. It took us a year to clean it up. When we had our first show, it was the Chicano artists that showed there first, but we invited everyone from the community, and I'd have to say it would be one of the first times that you had people from all various groups show up in an interior space and appreciating the art and having fun and discussing things, because this would have been between all the various major riots. This would have been during a time when people were really not too clear on the relationship and the direction of Los Angeles. But it did contribute also, the group that emerged out of that were some of the, I would have to say, blue chip artists that would emerge out of that and to help actually establish places such as Mocha and other kinds of things, and people that would in the future play a role in establishing and building the Getty, and other people that would then encourage people to contribute, to be students at Otis, Occidental, CalArts, all these different institutions, and introducing even the possibility of participating in these institutions when maybe there had been no even a hint that it would be possible to grow art and make Los Angeles a center of the arts, and one that would be for everyone. And again, it's this idea of allowing people to say hello to one another in a friendly environment, and to recognize that quite possibly we are all human beings.
Thank you for such a marvelous presentation. I'm just very moved. I have two questions. You can pick either one and just throw the other one out if you like. So I'm interested in this binary that happens often in discussions of art, where the art has to be aesthetic or it has to be political. And I think it's like a false binary. I mean, to me, I don't know if you agree, but I think everything is both aesthetic and political.
Right.
And just as a quick example from PAMLA, we were looking for a place for this year, and I went to, I don't know if people know this, but I went to the Fairplex, because where the LA County Fair is, and they wanted us to come there. They were giving us a lot of benefits, and then they told me, oh, by the way, I didn't know this, by the way, we have many, many children here that are migrant children that are, and I had to take a COVID test and sign in, and I said, so I said to myself afterwards, because I saw the kids, you know, and I thought, do we have the panel conference where on the very same space where we've decided to store human beings like that?
Yeah.
Or and this is why I'm telling you, is because it was a decision. I mean, it was a hard decision, because in some ways, talking about it is uncomfortable and painful, and it would have made the conference very strange. On the other hand, I think every decision is aesthetic and also political. But I'm curious if you agree with that. My second one is more about embodied performance in theatrical sense, even on the streets, versus photography. And how much do you think in your work about the two? Because it's such an interesting thing to think about. They seem like different realms of the brain when you're designing something for the photograph versus for the actual performance in the person. But I don't know if that's the case. So anyway, those are my two questions. You could ignore either one if you want, just say something else.
Maybe I'll respond to the photographic one first. The OSCO group, during the era of OSCO, none of the work was actually printed. The work was first printed, sort of a very small selection was printed for a show at the Pompidou in, I think, 2010. But when the OSCO exhibition took place at the LA County Museum, I was very surprised because during the OSCO era, always the discussion was about the painters, which would have been wrongfully heard, but the exhibition was primarily photographic. And it was the first time that many of the works had ever been printed at all, and those that were not actually intended to be printed were still printed, and now became objects of art. And then also went into this whole realm where they were discussed as such. And so the works that came after that moment still had that concern. That was the component that was considered is like, I'm still doing performance, but as a work that's going to be printed and probably be entered in either into the market or to the canon, and also in terms of publicity. So, for instance, many of the works that are here have been on the cover of the major art magazines or have been used. The instant mural was actually the key figure that was used to promote the Getty's Pacific Standard Time all around the world. And all of a sudden, this very obscure thing is kind of the image that's selling something, a multi-million-dollar project. And when I took that photograph, I don't think any of us could afford a cup of coffee. And so it's this kind of thing that really is strange about art, and the notion of something being aesthetic and political. I'd have to say it's political if it really does prove it's got some aesthetic to it, with causing people to respond to it. And you'll find people that are really enjoy something, and then people that find it to be fearful. And again, again, as I was declared falsely to be a danger, it's always been that it's been the idea to extend a hand out to people and to meet people. And as I mentioned before, I had been slapped in the face at the age of 4.5, and I did not hit back. So it was the idea that, you know, maybe there's a better way to respond, and maybe to convince other people. So, you know, I sometimes think when I'm teaching at CalArts, I'm not sure if one of those students might be that person's great-grandchild, and I will make sure that child is treated with great respect.
Any other questions?
We have maybe one.
One more? Well, I would ask one. Oh, no, we have people in the back. Okay. I can ask you a question anytime.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My name is Raphael. I'm from UCSC. And I was really struck when you were talking about the live mural with the tape, and when you were discussing how Chicanos in LA weren't allowed to hang out in groups larger than a certain number of people. And that reminded me a lot of my own experiences as a Chicano, but in the Central Valley, where people are spread out and there's really no form of gathering together. And I'm wondering how art can serve as a forum for this community building where community building feels impossible. And what are your thoughts on like how these coalitions are constructed through art?
Well, I think part of the idea of the art is that it's affirming, first of all, that you can manifest an idea into becoming something that could be something perceived through your senses. Others can see it or touch it or smell it or taste it. But at the same time, usually the notion of art is that it communicates an idea on some level. And again, you know, there might be some ideas that other people don't share or are unaware of, or the fact that even people exist. But you know, it's something that's what human beings are known for, is communicating. And so the idea is that by creating art, and in our current situation, most of our information is mediated by someone else. It's mediated through corporations somewhere else, and kind of evades sort of a direct interpersonal communication aside from the mediated materials that deliver information to us. So if you can do something that in a way seems to be inherent from your area, where people can identify and bring forth something that maybe other people wouldn't be interested in bringing forth, might actually attract attention from even those that might seem hostile to the idea, but at the same time would have to acknowledge that it actually exists.
Well, thank you. Thank you
Thank you
all
very
so
much.
much.